The courtroom in Denver, Colorado felt like a tomb on this gray February morning. Sarah Mitchell sat in the hard wooden chair at the defendant's table, her posture rigidly upright despite every muscle in her body screaming to collapse inward. Her hands rested on the table in front of her, and she had to consciously prevent her fingers from trembling. She'd practiced this moment 1,000 times in front of her apartment mirror. How to sit, how to breathe, how to present herself as a woman who deserved to be a mother again. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a navy blazer over a cream blouse that her therapist had suggested would convey stability and professionalism. But beneath the carefully chosen outfit, Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. 18 months. That's how long it had been since she'd held her daughter, Emma. 18 months of waking up to an empty space in the bed beside her. 18 months of hearing a child's laugh on the street and feeling as though her chest might split open. 18 months of living in a prison of her own making, not because she was incarcerated, but because the courts had decided she was unfit, unstable, dangerous to the one person she loved more than life itself. The custody battle had begun almost 2 years ago, after Sarah's ex-husband, Daniel, had called the police following a particularly vicious argument. The fight had been ugly, born from Sarah's discovery of his infidelity and his subsequent threats to take Emma away. When officers arrived at their home, they found Sarah hysterical and Daniel with a scratch on his arm. He told the police she'd attacked him in a rage. What he didn't mention was that the scratch had come when he'd grabbed her hair and thrown her against the wall, or that he'd spent the previous 6 months having an affair with his business partner. What he didn't tell them was that Sarah had been fighting for her life, not attacking him in anger. The police report, written by an officer who had no interest in the nuances of domestic violence, told a very different story. Daniel's lawyer had been ruthless. They painted Sarah as an unstable, volatile woman prone to violent outbursts. They presented testimony from Daniel's friends, people who had never witnessed anything, but who were willing to describe Sarah as erratic and emotionally unbalanced. They brought in a psychologist who had interviewed Sarah for exactly 40 minutes and declared her mentally unfit. They dredged up an incident from Sarah's college days when she'd struggled with depression and had taken antidepressants, using it as evidence of lifelong mental illness. When Sarah's own lawyer tried to present evidence of Daniel's infidelity and his history of controlling behavior, the judge seemed almost dismissive. The judicial system, Sarah learned, favored fathers over mothers when it came to custody disputes, particularly if they could frame the mother as unstable. The judge assigned Emma to live with her paternal grandmother, Patricia, a woman who had never approved of Sarah anyway. The visitation plan was sparse and conditional, supervised visits once a month for just 2 hours. It was devastating. It was cruel. And Sarah had nearly given up entirely. But something shifted inside her during those first dark months. A friend from her support group, a woman named Lisa who had her own custody battle, told her something that pierced through Sarah's despair. The only way to win this is to become the woman they say you're not. Change your life so radically, so completely, that they can't ignore it. Make it impossible for them to deny that you've transformed. So Sarah did. She stopped drinking, something she'd only done occasionally, but something the opposing counsel had exaggerated into a serious problem. She joined an AA group and got a sponsor, even though technically she wasn't an alcoholic. She saw a therapist twice a week, sometimes more, and she worked through her trauma, her anger, her grief. She enrolled in night classes and became certified as a medical transcriptionist, landing a job at a local hospital that paid decently and looked stable on paper. She moved out of the apartment she'd shared with Daniel and rented a small, modest place in a good neighborhood with good schools. She decorated Emma's room with purple walls and star-shaped nightlights, filling the shelves with books and toys, preparing a space for a daughter who wasn't allowed to visit. And she had Duke. Duke had been a miracle. Sarah had found him at an animal shelter, a 2-year-old German Shepherd mix who had been surrendered by a family who couldn't handle his energy. The dog had been scheduled for euthanasia. He had only 3 days left when Sarah walked into the shelter on a gray Tuesday afternoon. She'd gone there just to volunteer, to do something meaningful with her grief. But then she'd seen Duke, and something in his eyes called to her. Here was another being who'd been abandoned, who'd been deemed too much trouble, who was facing erasure simply because no one wanted to invest the time to understand him. She'd adopted him on the spot, spending money she didn't really have. Training Duke became Sarah's meditation, her purpose, her reason to get up in the morning. She took him to obedience classes, taught him commands, walked him for hours while listening to podcasts about positive parenting and emotional intelligence. Duke became the centerpiece of her new life, a symbol of her commitment to building something healthy and whole. And somewhere in the process of caring for him, she learned how to care for herself again. Now, sitting in this courtroom, Sarah thought about that small apartment that had become a sanctuary. She thought about Duke sleeping at the foot of her bed, his warm presence a comfort on nights when the loneliness felt unbearable. She thought about the photographs on her walls, every single one featuring Emma, from newborn pictures to a recent photo from Emma's 3rd birthday that she'd been allowed to attend, supervised by her lawyer in the grandmother's living room. Emma had worn a pink crown and had laughed at the terrible clown Daniel's mother had hired, and Sarah had recorded that laugh, playing it back countless times just to hear her daughter's joy. Her lawyer, Robert Chen, sat beside her looking composed but serious. He told her during their last meeting to prepare herself for disappointment. He'd explained that Judge Patricia Holloway had a reputation for favoring fathers in custody disputes, particularly when they could paint the mother as unreliable. He'd warned her that Daniel's wealth, he owned a successful tech company, meant he could afford the best lawyers, expert witnesses, and an overall more polished presentation. Sarah was the underdog in every possible way. But today, Emma was going to testify. That had been the one breakthrough in the case. At 3 years old, Emma would be questioned about her life, her living situation, and her relationship with both parents. Sarah's lawyer believed that a young child's testimony, when handled carefully, could cut through all the legal maneuvering and reveal simple, honest truth. Children, he'd said, don't have the sophistication to lie effectively about love. As Sarah watched the courtroom door, waiting for her daughter to appear, she felt something shift in her chest. It was fragile and dangerous, this feeling of hope. Hope was what had kept her going through the darkest months, but it was also what made everything hurt more intensely. What if the judge dismissed Emma's words the way she dismissed Sarah's? What if Daniel's lawyers manipulated a 3-year-old's testimony? What if, after all this effort, all this transformation, all this pain, Sarah still lost? She gripped her hands together, closed her eyes for just a moment, and prayed to whatever universe might be listening. Not for herself. She'd made peace with whatever punishment the system decided to inflict. But for Emma, for her daughter to know that her mother loved her, that she'd fought for her, that she'd changed her entire life just for the possibility of being a mother again. That prayer, whispered silently in a cold Denver courtroom, would turn out to be the most powerful thing Sarah could have done. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Denver Police Department's K-9 training facility, casting long shadows across the polished concrete floor. Officer Marcus Chen arrived at 6:30 a.m., precisely 40 minutes before his shift was scheduled to begin. This had been his routine for the past 8 years, arriving early to prepare, to center himself, and most importantly, to spend quiet time with his partner. Duke was already awake in his special climate-controlled kennel, his ears perking up the moment he heard Marcus's familiar footsteps echoing through the facility. The German shepherd's entire body seemed to vibrate with anticipation, his tail wagging so hard his muscular frame rocked back and forth. "Good morning, buddy," Marcus whispered, his deep voice tender and full of affection. He unlocked the kennel and Duke bounded out, immediately jumping up to place his front paws on Marcus's chest. But it was a controlled jump, trained and disciplined, not the chaotic greeting of an untrained dog. Duke had been Marcus's partner since the dog was 18 months old, and in the 7 years they'd worked together, An unbreakable bond had formed between them. Marcus scratched behind Duke's ears, feeling the soft fur and the warmth of the dog's body. Duke's golden brown eyes gazed up at him with complete trust and unconditional love. In that moment, Marcus felt the weight of the day ahead settling onto his shoulders. Today was different. Today, Duke wouldn't be working a drug bust or tracking a missing person. Today, he would be serving in a capacity that Marcus considered far more important and far more delicate. He would be a comfort dog in a custody hearing. The case file had been sitting on Marcus's desk for a week, and he'd read it multiple times, each reading filling him with a deeper sense of purpose. A mother separated from her 3-year-old daughter, 18 months without contact. A custody battle that hinged on whether a judge would believe in second chances, in redemption, in the transformative power of love and commitment. Marcus walked Duke to the grooming station, where he began the meticulous process of preparing his partner for the courtroom. He shampooed Duke's thick coat with a special hypoallergenic formula, working the lather in methodically while Duke stood perfectly still, trained to remain patient and calm during grooming. As the warm water cascaded over the dog's body, Marcus spoke to him softly, explaining what the day would hold. He had learned that Duke seemed to understand his words, or at least understood the tone and intention behind them. The dog's ears would perk forward, his eyes would track Marcus's face, and he seemed to absorb the information in whatever way a dog processes human language. "Today is important, boy," Marcus said, running the towel over Duke's coat. "There's a little girl today. She's scared and confused, and she needs you to be the best version of yourself. She needs you to show her that it's okay to be brave, that it's okay to tell the truth, that love matters more than anything else in the world." Duke shook himself, sending water droplets flying, and then pressed his head against Marcus's leg as if to acknowledge the mission ahead. The certification process for courthouse comfort dogs was rigorous and demanding. When Duke had first begun his training for this specialized role 2 years ago, he had already been an exceptional police dog. He had tracked suspects, detected narcotics, and performed search and rescue with remarkable precision. But comfort work required a completely different skill set. It demanded not just obedience, but emotional intelligence. It required a dog who could sense fear and anxiety in others and respond with calm, grounding presence. Duke had undergone 200 hours of specialized training with a trauma-informed dog behaviorist, learning how to position himself near distressed children, how to remain completely still when touched, how to offer comfort without overwhelming or distracting. Marcus had watched Duke's transformation with wonder. The dog had been naturally gifted at the work from the beginning, as if some part of him understood that his role had shifted from apprehension to compassion, from protection through force to protection through presence. Duke had worked in 3 previous custody cases, and in every single instance, the child's testimony had been marked by remarkable clarity and courage. There was something about having a calm, present dog beside you that seemed to unlock a child's ability to speak their truth. As Marcus brushed Duke's coat until it gleamed like polished mahogany, he thought about the science behind what they were doing. Research showed that dogs reduced cortisol levels, the stress hormone, in children facing trauma. They lowered blood pressure and increased oxytocin, the hormone associated with bonding and trust. But beyond the biochemistry, there was something almost spiritual about what happened when a frightened child connected with a dog who asked nothing of them except to be present. Dogs didn't judge. They didn't have agendas. They simply existed in the moment, offering an unconditional acceptance that many traumatized children had never experienced from the adults in their lives. Marcus dressed in his formal police uniform, the one he reserved for courtroom appearances. His badge was polished to a mirror shine, his boots gleaming. He wanted to look professional and trustworthy, someone a judge would believe could handle a sensitive situation with care and competence. At 8:00 a.m., he clipped Duke's service vest onto the dog's broad chest, a deep blue vest embroidered with Courthouse Comfort Dog in gold lettering. The vest transformed Duke into an official working dog, and even the dog seemed to stand straighter, as if he understood the significance of the garment. The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes through downtown Denver traffic. Marcus kept one hand on Duke's shoulder as he drove, occasionally glancing at his partner in the rearview mirror. The dog was calm and focused, staring out the window with the alertness of a trained professional. Marcus had brought Duke's favorite toys, a tennis ball and a rope toy, but he knew they wouldn't be needed inside the courtroom. Once they entered that space, Duke's job would be to exist in a state of absolute readiness, attuned to the emotional needs of the child who would soon take the witness stand. As Marcus pulled into the parking lot of the Denver District Court building, he took several deep breaths, centering himself. In his 8 years with the K-9 unit, he had seen dogs transform lives in countless ways, tracking down missing children, detecting bombs, apprehending dangerous criminals. But this gentle work of comfort and presence, felt just as vital, just as heroic. He looked at Duke, and the dog looked back at him, and in that moment of connection, Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for this magnificent animal who would, in just a few hours, help change the course of a little girl's life. "Let's go save a family," Marcus whispered, and together man and dog stepped out of the car and walked toward the courthouse doors, ready to bear witness to the healing power of love. Emma Mitchell had been awake since 5:00 a.m., though her grandmother Patricia hadn't realized it. The little girl had lain in her narrow twin bed, staring at the ceiling of the modest bedroom she'd occupied for the past year and a half, her small heart hammering with an anxiety she was far too young to fully understand. She knew something important was happening today, something that adults seemed very worried about. She'd overheard whispered conversations between her grandmother and the social worker who visited every month. Words like custody and testimony, and what's best for Emma had floated through the house like ghosts, scary and incomprehensible. At 6:30 a.m., Patricia had knocked gently on the bedroom door and stepped inside, carrying a fresh white dress with yellow daisies embroidered across the front. The dress was new, bought specifically for today, and Emma could sense that it held significance. Patricia's face was tight with stress, her gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch the skin on her forehead. The older woman smiled at her granddaughter, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," Patricia said, her voice artificially cheerful. "Today's the big day. We need to get you looking your very best. The judge is going to want to see what a beautiful, well-cared-for girl you are." Emma had nodded slowly, not fully grasping what any of this meant. A judge, a courtroom. She had only vague memories of her mother, fragmented images that sometimes felt like dreams. There was a woman's voice, gentle and warm. There was the feeling of being held, safe and secure. There was a big dog with a black coat and kind eyes. But these memories were becoming increasingly blurry, like photographs left out in the sun too long, the details fading into abstraction. Patricia had dressed Emma carefully, as if preparing a doll rather than a living, breathing child. She'd brushed her blonde curls until they shone, spraying them with a product that made Emma's nose itch. She'd put on white socks with lace trim and black patent leather shoes that squeaked when Emma walked. Everything about the outfit felt wrong, too stiff, too formal, too much like armor designed to protect against something Emma didn't understand. During breakfast, Emma had barely eaten. Patricia had made her favorite cereal, but the milk tasted strange, and the wheat circles felt like cardboard in her mouth. Patricia kept glancing at her phone, checking the time, her leg bouncing with nervous energy under the table. Emma had picked up on her grandmother's anxiety like a sponge absorbs water, and her own nervousness had crystallized into something tangible and heavy in her chest. "You're going to talk to a very nice judge today," Patricia had explained, her words careful and rehearsed, as if she'd practiced them many times. "And you're going to tell the judge about where you live and who takes care of you. You're going to tell the judge how happy you are here with me. Okay, sweetheart?" Emma had nodded, though she didn't fully understand. She knew she was supposed to say she was happy. She knew that was the answer Patricia wanted, but the truth was more complicated. Emma loved her grandmother. Patricia was kind and made sure she had food and toys and a warm bed, but something essential was missing. There was an ache inside her, a longing for something she couldn't name. Sometimes she would wake up crying from dreams about a woman's face, and no amount of Patricia's comfort could quiet the emptiness that followed. The drive to the courthouse had felt eternal. Emma had sat in her car seat, her legs swinging slightly, watching Denver's downtown buildings grow taller as they approached. Patricia's hands had gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had made Emma use the bathroom before they left. You don't want to have an accident in the courtroom, do you? But Emma's bladder felt full anyway, a physical manifestation of her anxiety. When they arrived at the courthouse, Emma had never seen anything so imposing. The building seemed to touch the sky, all gray stone and enormous doors. Patricia had held her hand as they walked through security, where a guard had wanded them both with a strange beeping device. Emma's heart had begun to race. This place felt important and serious and scary. The hallway outside the courtroom was cold and echoing. Emma's new shoes had clicked loudly against the marble floor, and she had clung to Patricia's leg. There were people in suits everywhere, talking quietly to each other, looking at papers, looking at Emma with expressions she couldn't interpret. A woman with kind eyes had approached them, the guardian ad litem, Patricia had explained, and had knelt down to Emma's level. "Hi, Emma, my name is Sarah," the woman had said. "I'm here to make sure you're okay today. You're going to talk to a judge and you're going to answer some questions. The judge is very nice and you can tell her anything you want. Okay?" Emma had nodded, but her throat had felt tight, as if her voice had disappeared. Now, standing in the doorway of the courtroom itself, Emma felt as if she'd stepped into another world entirely. The space was vast and intimidating, with high ceilings that seemed impossibly far away and wood paneling that made everything feel dark and serious. The judge sat elevated behind an enormous desk, looking powerful and distant and absolutely terrifying to a 3-year-old. There were lawyers in dark suits positioned at tables, their faces stern and focused. There was a court reporter with strange fingers hovering over a peculiar keyboard. There was a bailiff in a uniform. And there was the witness stand, a special chair designed for child witnesses, but it looked like a throne designed for giants to Emma. Patricia released her hand and guided her toward that chair. Emma's legs felt like they were moving through water, heavy and slow and resistant. Every eye in the courtroom seemed to be fixed on her. She was acutely aware that she was being evaluated, assessed, judged, not by the judge yet, but by everyone present. She could feel the weight of their attention, and it felt suffocating. The bailiff helped her into the chair, which was elevated so that she could see over the edge of the witness stand. Her small feet swung uselessly in the air, not reaching the footrest. The chair suddenly felt very high, very unstable. Patricia had taken her seat in the gallery, several rows back, and Emma could no longer see her. The judge looked down at her from an impossible height, her expression neutral and unreadable. Emma's hands gripped the sides of the chair so tightly her small knuckles turned white. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow. She could feel tears pricking at her eyes, though she didn't want to cry. Crying seemed like it would be a failure, a sign of weakness. But the fear was overwhelming, a tidal wave threatening to pull her under. The judge began speaking, her voice surprisingly gentle, but Emma could barely comprehend the words. Something about testifying, something about answering questions truthfully. Emma's heart thundered in her chest so hard she was certain everyone in the courtroom could hear it. Her mouth was dry. Her palms were sweating. She felt utterly, completely alone. And that's when everything changed. Officer Marcus Chen stood at the back of the courtroom, Duke's leash held loosely in his hand, watching the small figure hunched in the witness chair with the weight of the world on her tiny shoulders. He could see the signs of acute stress in the 3-year-old's body language, the way her hands gripped the chair, the rapid rise and fall of her chest, the barely perceptible trembling that ran through her frame. Every muscle in Duke's body seemed to sense the distress as well. The dog's ears perked forward, his nose twitching slightly, his entire being attuned to the emotional landscape of the courtroom. Marcus made his move with deliberate slowness. He had learned through his extensive training with Duke that sudden movements or rapid approaches could startle a frightened child further. Instead, he walked with measured, gentle steps, his posture relaxed and non-threatening. Duke moved beside him with the grace of a dancer, his trained paws making soft clicking sounds against the polished courtroom floor, a rhythm that seemed to echo through the silence like a heartbeat. Judge Patricia Holloway glanced up, acknowledging their presence with a subtle nod. She had approved Duke's involvement in this testimony, having reviewed the research on comfort dogs and their effects on child witnesses. But even with her judicial experience, even with her understanding of trauma and child psychology, she couldn't have anticipated what was about to unfold. The prosecution lawyer paused mid-step, papers held loosely in his hands, as he watched Marcus position Duke beside the witness stand. Emma didn't notice immediately. She was too deep in her own internal world of fear and anxiety, too focused on the overwhelming sensory input of the courtroom to register anything beyond her own thundering heartbeat. The judge had finished her gentle explanation of what testifying meant, and the prosecution lawyer was beginning to approach with his first question. Emma's eyes were fixed on the lawyer's face, her body rigid with tension, her throat constricted so tightly she wasn't sure words could even escape. Then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in her awareness. A new presence had materialized beside her chair, a warm, solid presence that seemed to radiate a completely different energy than everything else in the courtroom. Emma's eyes shifted sideways, drawn by an instinct she didn't fully understand. She glanced down, and in that instant, time seemed to suspend itself. There, sitting calmly beside the witness stand with his dignified posture and his intelligent dark eyes, was a German shepherd, a large, muscular dog with a coat the color of mahogany and ebony, a dog with soft eyes that looked directly at Emma's face with what could only be described as recognition and understanding. Emma's breathing stopped. Her hands released their white-knuckled grip on the chair. Every fiber of her being froze as recognition crashed through her like an ocean wave. "Duke," she whispered, the name escaping from her lips before her conscious mind had fully registered what was happening. The courtroom, which had been filled with the subtle background hum of activity and tension, fell into a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Papers rustled as lawyers exchanged confused glances. The court reporter's fingers hovered above her keyboard, uncertain whether to document this moment or wait for clarity. Judge Holloway's eyes widened slightly, the only outward sign of her surprise. In the gallery, Patricia's face drained of color, her hand flying to her mouth. But Emma was oblivious to all of this reaction. Her entire universe had contracted to a single point of focus, the dog beside her. Tears began to stream down her cheeks, not tears of fear, but tears of recognition, of memory, of something profound being suddenly restored. Her small hand trembled as she reached out, and Duke, in perfect response to his training and to something deeper than training, to his own instinct and love, turned his head slightly toward her, allowing her to touch his head. "That's Mommy's dog," Emma breathed, the words coming out broken and fractured, as if she was confirming something sacred, something she had been afraid to acknowledge even to herself during these 18 months of separation. The enormity of the recognition seemed to overwhelm her. This dog, this beloved creature who had been such an integral part of her earliest memories, was here, in this terrifying place, with her. Sarah Mitchell, sitting at the defendant's table, suddenly gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded almost like a cry of pain. Her hands flew to her face, and her entire body seemed to convulse with emotion. Her lawyer, Robert Chen, put a steadying hand on her shoulder, though his own expression registered shock. No dog had been mentioned in the case files. No pet was listed among the assets or responsibilities of Sarah's household. How could this be? Officer Marcus Chen remained perfectly still, though his own eyes glistened with unshed tears. He hadn't known. The court had approved Duke's participation based on his credentials as a comfort dog, But Marcus had had no knowledge that this particular dog had previously lived with the witness or with Sarah Mitchell. The universe seemed to have orchestrated something far more profound than anyone had anticipated. Emma's hand was now fully extended, her small fingers stroking the soft fur of Duke's head and neck. The dog responded to her touch with gentle acceptance, his tail beginning a slow, measured wag that seemed to communicate profound understanding. Duke's presence beside Emma seemed to physically anchor her to something real, something true, something that existed outside the frightening architecture of the courtroom. "His name is Duke," Emma said again, as if by repeating it she could solidify the reality of what was happening. Her voice was still small and uncertain, but it contained a new element: recognition, memory, truth breaking through the fog of trauma and separation. The prosecution lawyer stood frozen, uncertain how to proceed. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't part of the narrative they had carefully constructed over months of depositions and testimony. The presence of this dog, and more importantly, the child's absolute recognition and love for the animal, suggested a connection, a relationship, a piece of the truth that hadn't been fully revealed. Judge Holloway slowly set down her pen. She removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, a gesture that suggested she understood the magnitude of what she was witnessing. This moment, this unexpected reunion between a frightened child and a beloved dog, had the potential to shift the entire trajectory of the case. It suggested that Emma's memories of her mother, memories that had been fading, becoming uncertain, vulnerable to suggestion, were not false. They were real. They were vivid enough that a 3-year-old could recognize an animal after 18 months of separation, with absolute certainty. Duke continued to sit calmly beside Emma, allowing her touch, his presence a constant steady thing in the chaos of emotion and revelation. The dog seemed to understand that this was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done. This was comfort in its purest form, not a trained response, not a performed service, but the simple, powerful reality of a child recognizing and being recognized by a beloved companion. The courtroom held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sounds were Emma's soft breathing, the gentle clicking of Duke's nails as his tail wagged, and the faint rustling of papers that nobody was really reading anymore. In that moment, before the questions resumed, before the lawyers attempted to process this unexpected development, there existed a space of pure, unvarnished truth. A truth that a dog and a 3-year-old girl had revealed simply by recognizing each other. The single word, Duke, hung in the courtroom air like a bell that had just been struck, its vibrations rippling outward and touching every person present. Emma spoke the name with absolute certainty, with the kind of conviction that only comes from deep, genuine memory. Not a guess, not a rehearsed response to coaching. This was the voice of a child speaking truth, so fundamental and undeniable that it couldn't be questioned or dismissed. Sarah Mitchell's entire body went rigid in her chair. Her lawyer, Robert Chen, who had been reviewing notes and preparing for what he expected would be an uphill battle, suddenly looked up. His pen fell from his hand and clattered against the wooden table with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent courtroom. Sarah's mouth had fallen open, and tears were streaming down her face, not the quiet tears of controlled emotion, but the profound, shoulder-shaking sobs of a woman who had just heard her daughter speak her name after 18 months of enforced silence. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking on each syllable. "Oh my God, she remembers, she remembers." Robert placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, squeezing it gently, silently telling her to maintain composure, though his own eyes had grown wet with tears. He glanced at Officer Marcus Chen, confusion and dawning comprehension flickering across his face. The defense had known nothing about this dog. The case files had made no mention of a pet. How was this possible? In the gallery, Patricia's face had turned ashen. Her lips moved wordlessly, and her hands gripped the edge of the bench in front of her so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had known nothing of this reunion. She had prepared Emma carefully, coached her on what to say, tried to build a narrative of a child content with her grandmother's care. But in a single moment, that carefully constructed narrative had been obliterated by the simple fact of recognition. Judge Patricia Holloway removed her glasses slowly, deliberately, and set them on her desktop. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, her expression had shifted. The judicial neutrality that had characterized her demeanor moments before had given way to something more human, more vulnerable. She had been a judge for 23 years, had presided over hundreds of cases, had heard countless testimonies and witnessed numerous dramatic courtroom moments. But she understood, in that instant, that she was witnessing something rare and powerful, the truth breaking through all barriers of time and trauma and separation. "Duke," Emma repeated, her voice growing slightly stronger with each repetition, as if speaking the name aloud was helping to solidify the memory, to make the dog's presence more real and more permanent. Her small hand continued to stroke Duke's head and neck, her fingers moving through his fur with the familiarity of long practice. The gesture was so natural, so unself-conscious, that it could only have come from repeated, intimate contact over an extended period. This was not a child meeting a dog for the first time. This was a child reuniting with a beloved companion. Duke responded to Emma's touch with a responsiveness that transcended his training. Yes, he had been trained to accept physical contact from children, to remain calm and still while being touched by hands that might be trembling or gripping with too much force. But what was happening now went deeper than training. The dog's entire body seemed to soften in recognition. His tail wagged with increasing enthusiasm. His eyes, which had maintained the alert focus of a working dog, took on a warmth and tenderness that suggested genuine emotional connection. The prosecution lawyer remained frozen, papers still held loosely in his hands. His carefully prepared questions, designed to elicit testimony about Emma's contentment in her grandmother's home, suddenly felt not just irrelevant but obscene. How could he ask a child about her happiness with a grandmother when she had just recognized and been reunited with a piece of her past that she had clearly never forgotten? How could he maintain an adversarial stance in the face of such obvious truth? Officer Marcus Chen's own eyes had filled with tears, though he maintained his professional composure. He had prepared Duke for countless courtroom appearances, but he had never witnessed anything like this. The dog was performing his role perfectly, but more than that, there was a genuine emotional bond at work here that transcended any training protocol. Marcus found himself thinking about the chain of coincidences that had led to this moment. Which supervisor had recommended Duke for this particular case? Which scheduling decision had placed this dog in this courtroom on this specific day? What force, whether one believed in fate or simple chance, had orchestrated this reunion? "His name is Duke," Emma said again, and this time her voice carried not just certainty but also a kind of ownership, a claiming of something that had belonged to her and that she had never stopped belonging to. She looked up at Officer Marcus Chen, her tear-stained face suddenly curious. "Why is Duke here? Is Mommy here?" The question was so innocent, so perfectly articulate in its directness, that it seemed to sear through every legal argument and procedural convention that had guided this case thus far. Emma wasn't asking complex questions about custody arrangements or testimony protocols. She was asking the simple, primal question of a child separated from her mother. Is she here? Has she come for me? Does she still want me? Sarah let out a sound that was part sob, part laugh, her hands covering her face as her body shook with emotion. Robert Chen leaned over and spoke quietly to her, reminding her that she needed to compose herself, that there would be time for reunion after the testimony concluded. But Sarah's eyes never left Duke and Emma, never wavered from the sight of her daughter touching the dog that had been part of their family, their home, their life together. Judge Holloway straightened in her chair, her expression one of grave concentration. She had made a judicial decision years ago that had separated a mother from her daughter based on testimony and reports and professional assessments. She had believed she was making the right decision, based on the evidence presented to her at that time. But now, watching a 3-year-old child recognize an animal after 18 months of separation with absolute, undeniable certainty, she found herself questioning the narrative she had been presented with. What else had this child remembered? What memories had persisted even as her conscious mind was being shaped by a new environment, new routines, new authority figures? "Officer Chen," Judge Holloway said, her voice carrying more emotion than was typical for judicial proceedings, "would it be appropriate to allow Duke to remain beside the witness for the duration of her testimony?" Officer Marcus Chen nodded immediately. "Yes, Your Honor, I believe that would be beneficial to the witness." The judge looked directly at the prosecution lawyer, a clear signal that she expected compliance with this order. He nodded slowly, still processing what had just occurred. The entire trajectory of the case had shifted in the moment it had taken for a child to recognize a dog. The careful arguments about Sarah's fitness as a mother suddenly seemed hollow in the face of this 3-year-old's demonstrated memory of a life, a home, and a beloved companion. Emma looked down at Duke, and Duke looked up at Emma, and in the space between them existed something that transcended words and legal arguments and custody evaluations. It was love in its purest form, the kind of love that doesn't diminish with time or separation, that survives trauma and uncertainty and the chaos of adult decisions. It was the truth, finally breaking through all the barriers that had been constructed to obscure it. The courtroom seemed to have transformed into a space where time moved differently. The clock on the wall continued its mechanical ticking, but the moments felt elongated, suspended in a bubble where the normal rules of proceeding and protocol no longer applied. Judge Holloway had granted Officer Marcus Chen's request without the usual procedural debate, and now Duke remained positioned beside Emma's chair, a steady, warm presence that seemed to unlock something fundamental within the terrified child. "Emma," the judge said softly, her voice stripped of its earlier formality, "would you like to tell us about Duke, about the time you spent with him?" Emma nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the dog's face. Duke's tail continued its gentle, rhythmic wagging, as if he understood that his role was to provide comfort while this child released the memories she had been carrying alone in her small heart. Emma took a deep breath, a child's breath, shaky and uncertain, and then the words began to tumble out, unprompted and uncoached, raw with the honesty that only a 3-year-old could provide. "Duke sleeps on my bed," Emma began, her voice gaining strength with each word. "He has a red ball with a squeaker inside and he carries it everywhere. He carries it to the kitchen and to the living room, and sometimes he tries to bring it to bed, but Mommy says no, not on the bed because it makes too much noise in the night time." The specificity of the detail was striking. This wasn't a vague recollection. This was a vivid, detailed memory of daily life, of routines, of a home where a mother had set gentle boundaries about where a dog could play with his toys. Sarah's hands trembled on the table in front of her. Tears continued to stream down her face, but her expression had shifted from despair to something approaching wonder. Every word from Emma's lips was confirmation of a life they had shared, a life that Emma had preserved in her memory like a photograph kept in a locked box. "When Mommy was sad," Emma continued, her words becoming more flowing now, as if the act of speaking these memories was opening a floodgate, "Duke would put his head in her lap, and they would cry together. Mommy would hold him and he would sit very still and let her hold him." The courtroom had gone utterly silent. Nobody moved. Nobody dared to interrupt the sacred act of a child releasing truth that she had been carrying alone. Robert Chen was frantically taking notes, though his hands shook as he wrote. This testimony was worth more than any expert witness, any forensic analysis, any argument his legal team could have constructed. This was a child's memory of a mother who was human enough to have sadness, vulnerable enough to lean on a dog for comfort, but also present enough, stable enough, loving enough to be a true parent. The picture Emma was painting contradicted every narrative the prosecution had built about Sarah being too unstable, too broken, too unfit to care for a child. "Tell us more about your mommy," the judge encouraged gently, and Emma's eyes lit up with the opportunity to speak about the person she had been separated from. "Mommy made cookies on Sundays," Emma said, her voice taking on a dreamy quality. "She let me stand on a stool and mix the dough. My hands got sticky and she would laugh. She would laugh and pick me up even when I was all sticky and covered in flour, and she would dance with me in the kitchen. Duke would dance too. He would jump around us in circles." The prosecution lawyer sat motionless, his face a study in conflicting emotions. Everything Emma was saying painted a picture of a functional, loving household. Yes, Sarah had experienced sadness, but which young mother hadn't? Yes, she had struggled, but struggling wasn't the same as failing. The narrative that had seemed so clear, so supported by evidence, was being systematically dismantled by a 3-year-old's memories. "Mommy cried one time because Duke was sick," Emma continued, her expression growing serious. "She cried really hard. She called someone on the telephone and she said Duke needed to go to a special doctor right now. She didn't have very much money, I heard her say that, but she said Duke was important and he needed to get better. She held him in her lap in the car and talked to him the whole way." Sarah let out a sound between a sob and a laugh, her hand covering her mouth. That sick day had been one of the most difficult of her life. Duke had eaten something he shouldn't have, and Sarah had maxed out a credit card to pay the emergency veterinary bill. She had been terrified, exhausted, and completely broke afterward. But Duke was family. Duke was part of their life, part of their love. There had been no question about what needed to be done. "Your mommy sounds like she loves you very much," the judge observed, and her voice carried unmistakable emotion. "She does," Emma said with absolute certainty. "She loves me and she loves Duke. We're a family." The simplicity of that statement, the fundamental truth of it, seemed to echo through the courtroom like the tolling of a bell. 3 people, 1 adult, 1 child, 1 dog, had formed a family. They had created a home together, however modest, however imperfect, however complicated by Sarah's journey towards sobriety and stability. That was the truth. The prosecution lawyer finally spoke, his voice subdued. "I'd like to take a brief recess, Your Honor." Judge Holloway nodded. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Emma, you're doing a wonderful job. You can rest for a moment." As the courtroom began to move, as people stood and stretched and whispered to one another, Emma remained still beside Duke, her hand resting on the dog's head, drawing strength from his presence. Officer Marcus Chen observed the shift in the room's energy with professional clarity. He had watched Duke work dozens of times, had seen the dog help children through trauma and fear, but he had never seen anything quite like this. The dog wasn't just providing comfort. He was serving as a bridge to truth, as a physical manifestation of memories that had been trying to break free all along. Emma's recollections weren't being drawn out through leading questions or coached responses. They were flowing naturally, organically, from a child who had finally been given permission, through the presence of a beloved companion, to speak what her heart had never forgotten. Patricia sat motionless in the gallery, her entire world shifted. She had believed she was doing the right thing by preparing Emma, by coaching her, by trying to present a narrative of happiness and contentment in her care. But watching Emma's face as she spoke about her mother, watching the joy that broke through the child's features when she talked about the kitchen dances and the sticky flour and the deep, unconditional love, Patricia understood that she had been fighting against something far more powerful than testimony or legal arguments. She had been fighting against love itself. When the recess ended, the prosecution lawyer approached the judge's bench. What he said was quiet, barely audible to those in the gallery, but the effect was immediate. Judge Holloway's expression shifted to something approaching relief. "The prosecution is withdrawing its objections to the defendant's petition," the lawyer stated quietly. "Based on the testimony provided, it is clear that there exists a substantial and ongoing relationship between the minor child and the defendant. We believe the court's interests and the child's interests are best served by pursuing reconciliation rather than continued separation. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Emma, not fully understanding the legal implications of what had just occurred, simply continued to rest her hand on Duke's head, drawing comfort from the steady presence of the dog who had loved her mother enough to be loved back, and who had loved her enough to help her find her way home. Judge Patricia Holloway sat behind her elevated bench, her judicial robe suddenly feeling heavier than it ever had before. She had been wearing that robe for 23 years, had made countless decisions that affected the lives of families in her district, had always strived to follow the law, to apply the evidence, to make rulings that were based on facts and legal precedent. But what she was witnessing now transcended the boundaries of typical courtroom procedure. She was watching truth, pure, unvarnished, utterly undeniable truth, break through like sunlight through storm clouds. The 15-minute recess had given her time to think, to reflect on the decision she had made in this case 18 months ago. She had reviewed the file during that break, reading through the testimony that had led to Sarah Mitchell losing custody of her daughter. The social worker's report about Sarah's instability following her divorce. The testimony from Patricia about Sarah's unreliability. The documentation of Sarah's struggle with substance abuse, which was real, which had happened, but which, the judge was now understanding, was not the complete story. What the judge saw now was the rest of that story. A woman who had recognized her own brokenness and had done the hard work of healing. A woman who had held on to her sobriety for a full year, who had secured employment, who had built a stable life. A woman who had loved her dog so completely that a 3-year-old child, separated from her mother for 18 months, could still recognize that love, could still remember it, could still be moved to tears by it. As the courtroom reconvened, Judge Holloway made a decision that departed from standard procedure. She instructed that Emma's testimony continue, but with a modification. Duke would remain at the child's side throughout the questioning. This was not typical. Usually, the presence of a comfort dog was merely permitted, tolerated as a kindness to the child. But Judge Holloway's decision to make Duke's presence a central, acknowledged part of the testimony sent a clear message to everyone in the courtroom. This dog matters. This relationship matters. This truth matters. "Miss Emma," the judge began, her voice carrying warmth that rarely entered the courtroom, "I want you to know that you're doing something very brave right now. You're helping everyone in this room understand what's true and what's important. Would you like to continue telling us about your life with your mommy?" Emma nodded, and as if understanding that the official questioning was resuming, she shifted her position slightly, pressing closer to Duke's side. The dog's presence seemed to have become her anchor, her source of strength. Robert Chen, the defense lawyer, had prepared to ask questions, but Judge Holloway made another unprecedented move. She asked the questions herself from the bench. "Emma, do you remember playing with your mommy?" the judge asked. "Yes," Emma said immediately. "We played with Duke. Mommy would throw the ball and Duke would run and get it and bring it back. Sometimes Duke would bring the ball to me instead of Mommy, and Mommy would laugh and say Duke loved me the most." The simplicity of the statement carried enormous weight. A 3-year-old describing normal, healthy play between parent and child. A mother joking, laughing, fully present in the moment with her daughter and her dog. "Did your mommy ever hurt you, Emma?" the judge asked gently. "No," Emma said with absolute certainty. "Mommy's hands are soft. Mommy holds me carefully." "Did your mommy take care of you? Did she make sure you had food and clothes and a safe place to sleep?" "Yes," Emma said. "Mommy always made sure I had food. She made me breakfast and lunch and dinner. Sometimes we ate the cookies we baked, and Mommy tucked me in at night. She would sing to me, and Duke would sleep at my feet to make sure I was safe." Sarah was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears. Each word from Emma was a vindication, a validation, a restoration of something she had thought was lost forever. "Emma, when your mommy was sad, what did you do?" Emma looked thoughtful for a moment. "I would sit with her, Duke would sit with her, and we would all be sad together, but then Mommy would say, "Thank you for being here with me. You make me feel better." And then we would feel better. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath, understanding the magnitude of what she was documenting. A child describing not a perfect mother, no such thing existed, but a real mother, a human mother, a mother who experienced difficult emotions but who allowed her children, including her four-legged child, to provide comfort and companionship. "Emma, do you want to live with your mommy?" the judge asked, and her voice carried unmistakable emotion. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I miss my mommy," she whispered. "I miss her every day. I dream about her. Sometimes I wake up and I'm sad because she's not there. I love Grandma, but I want my mommy." Patricia in the gallery felt something shift inside her. She had believed she was doing the right thing, that she was providing a stable home for a granddaughter who had been removed from an unstable situation. But she understood now that stability wasn't enough. Love between a mother and daughter couldn't be erased by 18 months of separation. A child's fundamental need for her mother couldn't be satisfied by the best intentions of a grandmother, no matter how caring. "Emma, do you remember Duke living with you and your mommy?" "Yes, Duke was born when I was 1 year old. Mommy got him from a place where dogs stay when nobody wants them. Mommy said Duke deserved to be loved and our family would love him, and we did. We all loved each other." The prosecution lawyer had no questions. When the judge asked if he wished to cross-examine, he simply shook his head. There was nothing to challenge, nothing to contest. The truth was too overwhelming, too clear, too undeniable. Judge Holloway called for a brief recess to allow all parties to prepare closing statements. As the courtroom emptied, Emma remained beside Duke, her small hand buried in the dog's fur. Officer Marcus Chen watched, understanding that he was witnessing the resolution of a profound legal and emotional crisis, not through legal maneuvering or expert testimony, but through the simple presence of a dog and the undeniable power of a child's love for her mother. During the recess, something unexpected happened. Sarah's lawyer approached Officer Chen, and with Judge Holloway's approval, Sarah was allowed to step outside the courtroom for just a moment. She knelt down to Emma's level, not touching her yet, respecting the legal boundaries that still technically separated them, but looking directly into her daughter's eyes. "Hi, baby," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Do you remember me?" Emma's face crumpled, and she nodded vigorously. "Mommy," she said, and it was the most beautiful word that had ever been spoken in that courthouse. "I've missed you so much," Sarah said. "Every single day, I've been working so hard to be a good mommy again, and I'm going to be. I promise you I'm going to be." Duke, sensing the emotional intensity of the moment, pressed his body against both of them, his tail wagging slowly, his presence a benediction on the reunion happening before him. And in that moment, in that space outside the courtroom, the real judgment had already been rendered, not by the judge, not by the lawyers, but by a 3-year-old child and a loyal dog who knew the difference between absence and presence, between loss and love. The courtroom felt different when everyone reconvened. The air itself seemed to have shifted, as if the weight of legal procedure had been replaced by something more fundamental, more true. Judge Patricia Holloway sat behind her bench in her formal black robe, but her expression carried a softness that hadn't been there before. She had made her decision. Not impulsively, not without careful consideration, but with the clarity that comes when a judge finally sees the complete picture. Not just the facts and evidence presented in initial hearings, but the living, breathing reality of a family's love. "This court," Judge Holloway began, her voice resonating through the quiet courtroom, "has reviewed the evidence, the prior testimony, and most importantly, the words and memories of the minor child, Emma Mitchell. It is clear to this court that the initial custody determination was made based on incomplete information. The defendant, Sarah Mitchell, has demonstrated extraordinary commitment to her rehabilitation. She has maintained sobriety for over 1 year. She has secured stable employment. She has established a permanent residence. Most importantly, the child in question has demonstrated clear, unequivocal recognition of and love for her mother, and has provided testimony, without any coaching or prompting, that demonstrates a deep, meaningful, and healthy bond between mother and daughter. Sarah sat motionless, afraid that any movement, any breath might shatter this moment. Furthermore, the judge continued, it is evident that the child's emotional and psychological well-being is best served by restoration of the primary parent-child relationship. The presence of the animal in this proceeding has served as a powerful testament to the stable, loving home environment that the defendant provided. A home where animals are cared for with compassion, where emotional vulnerability is treated with respect, where a child can be secure and loved. Such a home is precisely what this court believes serves the best interests of the child. Judge Holloway paused, looking directly at Sarah Mitchell. It is therefore the order of this court that Sarah Mitchell be granted primary custody of her daughter, Emma Mitchell, effective immediately. The minor child's residing with her maternal grandmother, Patricia Mitchell, is hereby terminated. The maternal grandmother shall have visitation rights on a schedule to be determined by the parents and their respective counselors, provided that such visitation is in the best interests of the child. The judge's gaze shifted to Emma, still sitting in the witness chair beside Duke. However, there is one additional condition in this order. The court recognizes that the animal known as Duke is not merely a pet, but rather an integral and irreplaceable member of this family unit. The child has demonstrated extraordinary emotional attachment to this animal. The defendant has demonstrated responsible pet ownership. Therefore, it is ordered that Sarah Mitchell shall provide a safe, stable home for Duke, and that Duke shall remain part of the family unit. This is not merely a recommendation, but a condition of the custody arrangement. Sarah's entire body shook with sobs, not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming relief, of vindication, of the restoration of something she had believed was lost forever. Robert Chen placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes glistening with tears. Around the courtroom, people were quietly wiping their eyes. Even the court reporter, who had documented thousands of cases with professional detachment, was visibly moved. "Is there anything either party wishes to say?" the judge asked, her tone inviting rather than procedural. Robert Chen stood. "Your Honor, on behalf of Ms. Mitchell and her daughter, I want to thank this court for taking the time to truly understand the situation before you. Justice has been served." The prosecution lawyer stood as well. "Your Honor, while we presented the evidence as we understood it at the time, we are gratified that the truth has emerged. We offer our congratulations to Ms. Mitchell and her daughter." Judge Holloway nodded. "Court is adjourned. Ms. Mitchell, you may take your daughter into your custody immediately. Officer Chen, would you be so kind as to escort Duke to the defendant?" What followed was unprecedented in the Denver District Courthouse. The judge, from her elevated position, stepped down from the bench, a violation of normal courtroom protocol, and walked directly to Emma. She knelt down to the child's level, something judges almost never did, and looked directly into the little girl's eyes. "You were very brave today, Emma," Judge Holloway said softly. "You told the truth, and the truth brought your mommy back to you. I want you to remember that your voice matters, your love matters, and your mommy is very, very lucky to have a daughter as special as you are." Emma nodded solemnly, as if understanding the weight of what the judge was saying. She glanced at Duke, then back at the judge. "Can mommy take Duke now?" Judge Holloway smiled, and it was a smile full of genuine warmth. "Yes, you can go to your mommy now." Sarah was standing when Emma turned to look at her. Their eyes met across the courtroom, the first real eye contact, the first acknowledgement of each other as separate beings in the same space, and Emma's face transformed. She scrambled down from the witness chair with Officer Marcus Chen's steady hand supporting her descent. Duke followed closely, his tail wagging with increasing enthusiasm, as if he understood that the moment they had all been waiting for had finally arrived. Emma ran. Not a 3-year-old's careful walk, but a full, abandoning run, her small legs pumping, her arms stretched out in front of her. Sarah knelt down to catch her daughter, and when they collided, it was with the force of 18 months of longing, of prayers whispered in the dark, of love that had never wavered despite separation. "Mommy," Emma sobbed into Sarah's shoulder. "Mommy, you came back, you came back." "I'm here, baby. I'm here," Sarah whispered, holding her daughter with a gentleness that conveyed the depth of her gratitude, her love, her absolute commitment to never letting this child go again. Duke pressed against them both, his body creating a circle of comfort and belonging. Officer Marcus Chen watched from a respectful distance, tears streaming openly down his face. He had been present at the moment when love had broken through all barriers, legal, temporal, emotional, and had proven itself to be the most powerful force in the courtroom. Patricia sat in the gallery, watching her granddaughter in her daughter's arms, watching Sarah weep with joy, watching Duke complete the circle of family. She understood now what she had been slow to see, that love between a mother and daughter couldn't be replicated or replaced, no matter how much care and stability a grandmother could provide. She had done the right thing in caring for Emma, but Sarah had done something more fundamental. She had loved deeply enough to transform herself, to fight for her child even when the odds seemed impossible. As Sarah, Emma, and Duke made their way out of the courtroom, the entire room seemed to exhale. People stood and applauded. Judges never normally allowed applause in their courtrooms, but Judge Holloway made no move to stop it. She understood that what had transpired was bigger than protocol, more important than procedure. It was justice in its truest form, the recognition of truth, the restoration of love, the healing of a broken family. In the courthouse parking lot, Officer Marcus Chen walked with Sarah, Emma, and Duke to their car. Emma held tight to her mother's hand with one hand and Duke's collar with the other, as if afraid that either of them might disappear if she let go. Sarah paused beside Officer Chen before placing Emma in the car seat. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Duke, I didn't even know Duke would be here today. I didn't plan any of this, but somehow he helped me get my daughter back." Officer Chen smiled, his eyes still wet with tears. "Duke didn't help," he said gently. "Duke simply reminded everyone what love looks like. You did the rest. Your sobriety, your commitment, your love for your daughter, that's what brought her home. Duke was just the mirror that showed everyone the truth." As Sarah fastened Emma into her car seat and Duke settled into the back with her, resting his head on her lap, Officer Chen stepped back. He watched the car drive away, a mother, a daughter, and a dog, finally reunited, finally whole. He thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment, about the small decisions that had accumulated into something profound. Which supervisor had recommended Duke for this particular case? Which scheduling decision had placed this dog in this courtroom? What force, whether fate or chance or something greater, had orchestrated this reunion? As Officer Chen walked back to his patrol car, Duke's vest hanging over his arm, he understood that some questions didn't need answers. Some moments simply existed as proof that the universe, sometimes, recognized love and did everything in its power to honor it. And sometimes, that recognition came through the presence of a loyal dog and the undeniable voice of a 3-year-old child speaking truth. 3 months later, Officer Marcus Chen received a photograph in the mail. It showed Sarah, Emma, and Duke sitting on a blue couch in a small living room. Emma was holding the red ball with the squeaker, laughing at something her mother had just said. Duke's tail was blurred with movement, and Sarah's face held a peace and joy that spoke of a woman who had fought for her redemption and had finally received it. On the back of the photograph, Sarah had written, "Thank you for reminding us what love looks like. Our family is whole again. Love, Sarah, Emma, and Duke." Officer Marcus Chen placed the photograph on his desk at the police station, and every morning when he arrived for his shift, he looked at it and remembered. Sometimes, Justice isn't about what judges decide or lawyers argue. Sometimes, justice is simply about love being witnessed, honored, and restored by those who have the courage to see it.